Hello, welcome to the NMAP lecture. Getting into some more cybersecurity stuff, we're now going to be looking at popular tools used for penetration testing, the first of which is an old classic NMAP. Alright, so today we are going to be using the CSVMs to play around with NMAP, so go ahead and get in there if you'd like to play along. Now, I would prefer that you not follow along with me as I do it so that we don't accidentally spam the network with tons of traffic. But at the same time, we are going to be using it on the exam, so if you want to treat this as kind of a stress test to see if you can mess it up, by all means, give it a go. And I'm going to need a volunteer at some point, and my volunteer, all I need you to do is host a TCP and a UDP server, any of the applications we've done so far. Just make sure for the TCP application it can handle more than one host being connected. So don't use like the one we used for the lab, but you can use, say, the solution for the previous homework. So just host, let's say, the solution for the previous homework, and do it on a port that I do not know. So do it on some port other than 6112, and just for purposes of making it a little easier today, do it on a port between 6 and 7000. So just pick a random port between 6 and 7000. So again, I'll need a volunteer to host a TCP and a UDP server. You can host both at the same time. Just run the mini clips and pick a random port between 6 and 7000 to run them on. And then I will try to figure out what port you're running them on in a bit. Alright, so next order of business, let's look at some slides to see how to use NMAP, and then we're going to give it a shot after we've looked at those slides. So, when we last left off, we were talking about Iowa State's contract of Coalfire Labs to perform a pen test, and how it didn't quite work out for Coalfire Labs, and due to a mix-up, they ended up spending some time in jail. So, it was a bit of a moral story, just telling you basically what you need to expect if you get into this profession, that you need to expect rigorous contracts and avoiding any kind of trouble with the law, and at the same time be aware that some people will not accept your get out of jail free card naturally, because if they were able to accept it so willingly, every criminal would carry around a get out of jail free card. And if the people on your card can't be contacted, or the police simply don't trust that the person on the other end is actually who they say they are, or any number of other reasons, you might still end up being arrested. So stuff does happen. And we'll probably look at that case a little bit more, because it's an interesting contract. We have a pen testing contract there. Those are always fun to read. See what else they do as part of the normal course of their profession as we learn some more of this stuff ourselves. Alright, so the first step in a penetration test of a remote network is to perform what we call reconnaissance. After the planning phase ends, some people say that the planning phase is basically step 0, and then the recon phase is the first actual step. During the recon phase, we are trying to find viable attack vectors. So what can we exploit inside of this organization? We're trying to determine what are the organizational weaknesses. These might be what people have the actual keys. So there are human beings who have organizational weaknesses. For example, who has the key to the building, who has the private security key for the web server. Basically, who is generally speaking, we're looking for the lowest level employee that we can dupe and get the highest level of access. Usually the lower level the employee, the easier they are to dupe. Not always true, but generally true. Easier they are to access, at least. The CEO doesn't just take phone calls from random strangers. But if we know that, say, the chief of the IT desk is able to have the web server keys, well, then that's something that we could definitely access, right? And in addition to organizational weaknesses, there are the technical weaknesses as well. So during this phase, you want to discover the network layout. What kind of machines are on the network? What are their IP addresses? So we're looking for their locations on the network. And then if possible, we also want to know where they're physically located. Where is the server? Is it in a closet somewhere? Is it in a secure room with a lock? What else is connected to the same switch as the server? Where are there loose Ethernet cables and such that we could connect to? This is where a university becomes a very easy target, because universities let everybody bring their own devices, and there's Ethernet jacks all over the place, so there are just thousands of machines in a university network. Why it's very difficult to secure any kind of network where you have basically the general public coming in and bringing their machines. And as we enumerate all the different machines on the network, we want to know which machines have authority or privilege. Where can we get in and then leverage our ability to get in to then access more and more stuff. Okay, so the phase here where we're trying to find all the different machines on the network and everything, that's often called enumeration. So we're enumerating all of the different machines that are running on the network. Some folks call it discovery, although some people make a differentiation between scanning and discovery and say that discovery is what you do without making any active traffic or any active attempts at enumeration. So discovery is done in a passive way. You could say, listen to the victim's traffic, listen to the target's traffic. So you might plug in sort of off their network somewhere, or you might just observe from a distance, but you wouldn't engage the target yet with any of your own traffic or any of your own attempts. So that's the distinction that sometimes is made. But otherwise, what we're trying to do here is we are trying to find all of the machines that are running on the network, and then we want to know, obviously, which ports on those machines are open. And remember, a port binds to a particular application. So when you write your little Java applications for the homework and whatnot, right, you bind a port, and that port is for your service, your application. So service and application, I'm going to use these words kind of interchangeably here. If you're used to service having a particular connotation in Windows, I apologize. So I'm not talking about like your Windows services. I'm talking about some application that is running on the computer. Every networked application is bound to at least one port, and in many cases they use the same port. So every time you run, say, color grid, it's going to use 6112 because that port is hard-coded in there. And if it wasn't hard-coded in there, it would be very difficult for clients to figure out where they have to connect. And likewise for pretty much other application out there, they use a particular port that's hard-coded so that clients know where to connect. That means that if you see a particular port open, you can make a pretty educated guess on what application or service they have running just based on the port that you see. And then with a little bit more information, like how does that port respond to traffic, you can usually make a very educated guess as to what happens to be running. And that's a process basically called fingerprinting, where you examine what kind of traffic you get from the port when you attempt to send it different things. So for example, if you were connecting to 6112 and you're trying to check for color grid, you would test and see, am I getting back the game state updates and stuff that I expect from a color grid server? If you get back something that looks like a game state update, this would be something that you've already saved in your database of what different applications look like. Well, then you are obviously dealing with color grid at that point, if that's what you get back. So NMAP is a old application, and it's probably the most popular for its task, or at least it's the most well-known. There are certainly many others today. NMAP has sort of fallen a little bit into obscurity in terms of updates. It hasn't really been kept up in, let's say, 5 years or so. It still gets occasional updates, but there are obviously other applications that cost money or that ship with software that does cost money, different penetration packages. But NMAP is clean and simple, and it has a lot of legacy behind it, so it's still probably the most popular enumeration tool. And it was created in 1997, but it's really an amalgamation of many different other tools created before that. For example, the largely considered first packet scanner, or some would say just the first relatively fast one, because there were others before it, but they were too slow, is something called Strobe. And Strobe was written by someone you might recognize, a teenager at the time named Julian Assange. Anybody recognize that name, Julian Assange? Yes, the same guy. He was well, I don't know if you want to say renowned or whatever, but he was a hacker in his teenage years, and he was fairly well known for it. And one of the things he's best known for is his authorship of Strobe, which goes on to be included in NMAP, so many of the functions here are of his doing. As you know, Julian is facing trial right now, or we could go to jail for many, many years. Yes, that's right. He is the founder of WikiLeaks, and he may very well see prison for many, many years for leaking information that people didn't particularly want him to leak. But what he is actually on trial for is hacking. He is accused of aiding then named Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, in hacking the information that led to all these different leaks about things that the military was doing and whatnot. And the crux of that investigation rests on Julian's past, writing things like Strobe. If it wasn't for his sort of notoriety in the hacking community, it's unlikely that the prosecution would have pursued this particular avenue. So Julian never really got into legal trouble for anything that he did when he was younger, but now that he's done something that some people don't like, you see that his hacking past is sort of an issue for him. So even if you don't necessarily get caught, and even if you do nothing particularly wrong as a hacker, you can still expect to face consequences later in your life. So it's not a good thing to be known as any kind of black hat or even gray hat hacker. It's not a good reputation to have. I might pull up the court documents for that investigation at some point later too. It's actually fairly interesting. The most foundational piece of evidence is Manning delivering to Julian a hash and asking, "Can you break this?" And Julian basically saying, "I'll run it by someone else and see." And that's interpreted basically as him aiding in the hacking of government property. That just, "I'll run it by someone else and see" line. So again, very interesting case. I encourage you to look into it. Very fun. We'll see if he actually ends up in prison. So what can NMAP do? NMAP can find online machines in an IP range. So this is the most basic enumeration technique, right? You're trying to find if a machine is online or offline. So you're scanning all of the IP addresses that you know in that network and checking to see if the machines are on or offline. Well, I'll hold off on this until later, but then I'm going to do this on the CSVM. So if you haven't already, bring your VM online, and hopefully you've already installed Nmap and ZenMap and everything. Oops. Okay, another thing that you're going to want to do once you've figured out all of the machines that are online is you're going to try to figure out what ports are open on all of them, and therefore what services they are running, but you're just, first of all, just looking at those ports. So for TCP, to see if a port is open, you try to perform a handshake. That's the easiest way to do it, right? If the handshake is successful, then it's open. If the handshake is unsuccessful, then it's not. If you get a reset message, then you are talking to a port that is behind a firewall or that doesn't have an active TCP session. Those are two simple techniques to do that. And by the way, for finding the online machines, I skipped over this. How do you do that? Well, you can ping them and see if they respond, but many machines don't respond to ping. So what other methods are there? There are quite a few. For UDP, it's a little bit more complicated to see if the port is open. If you're trying to connect to a port and you get an ICMP unreachable port closed message, well, then you know that it's at least firewalled. However, if the port is open and you try to send it UDP traffic, and let's say that the service that's running doesn't actually talk back at all, like the first application we wrote, right, where clients send it some text and it just prints it to the console, that application never responds to the client. So if a client sends that application traffic, the only thing they'll get back is nothing. So you basically determine that ports are open on UDP by the lack of any response. Occasionally you'll have UDP applications that send some kind of response, then you know for sure that they're open. But for UDP, you're actually looking for a lack of any response most of the time. And then again, not every machine even sends that ICMP unreachable message. Some machines send no response at all, which makes every port appear open. So you want to test for whether or not a port is closed or whether it is filtered. If it's filtered, then it's subject to a firewall. This can mean that you are still able to do something with it. Sometimes there are different exploits that involve targeting the firewall itself, so you're actually trying to trick the firewall into doing something. There are some exploits of that nature as well. But generally speaking, if a port is firewalled, there's not much you can do. It's pretty much the same as closed from your perspective. And pretty much every modern machine has some type of firewall. You're probably most familiar with Windows firewall, but then of course the router has its own level of firewalling too. And remember that the device that you're talking to, it could be a machine, it could be an actual computer running some services, or it could be a router, and behind that router could be a bunch of machines that the router services with a NAT. So if you see a port open on a router, then you know that there is another machine behind that router somewhere, which is being serviced by that router and NAT. After you're done enumerating the open ports, you're going to try to bind those to common services, and often you'll try to figure out what operating system they're running. Again, this is done using fingerprinting, so seeing what kinds of responses you get from their different open ports. This can often lead you to determine what operating system they're running. We won't get into this too much, but different operating systems have different methods of dealing with their window sizes and how they set different flags, and little subtleties like that can give away what operating system that the target is running on their machine. Now, the popularity of scanning tools like NMAP has led the folks who manufacture routers and others, so people who manufacture network materials in general, to develop tools that counter scanning. From the receiving end, when you're being scanned, a scan looks like a bunch of packets coming from one source, and they're coming into different ports, and maybe they're coming into different ports in sequence. It's a very suspicious looking thing to be scanned on the receiving end, right? You're seeing somebody try to connect to port 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. It's pretty obvious that they're trying to do something suspicious. So detecting scans like that is pretty straightforward. Another simple mechanism for defeating scans is just to limit the rate at which you send replies. So remember, in order to detect a closed UDP port, we need to get an ICMP unreachable. Well, there are some operating systems that just have a system where they'll only send one ICMP unreachable to an IP address per second. Okay, if they're only sending one per second and you have 65,000 ports to scan, that means it's going to take you at least 65,000 seconds, which is something like 8 hours or whatever, but it's a lot of time. If you raise that to 5 seconds, you can make a scan take several days. You can also block IP addresses that you suspect to be scanning, but this is a dangerous game because if the person is not scanning and you block them, then you may very well have just blocked a paying customer. That would be a problem. But oftentimes scans are pretty obvious, which leads to anti-scanning mechanisms, so trying to avoid being detected when you are scanning. There are many of these. Older approaches like idle scanning generally aren't popular anymore, or they're not possible because operating system manufacturers and router manufacturers have caught on, but there used to be ways to scan targets without them even seeing traffic from you. This is still possible to some extent, but most of these approaches don't work anymore, or they're very hard to implement. One thing that you can do if you are a professional, so if you're a cybersecurity firm or something, is send your scans from different addresses. So if you control, let's say, 1,000 different IP addresses all around the globe, as you probably would if you were a professional pen testing shop, well, you can scan 10 ports here and 10 ports there and 10 ports there, and then you can sort of combine all that information together. That becomes a lot less suspicious when it's coming from different places. You can stagger it out at different times. And there are already third-party tools that utilize NMAP and other similar applications to do exactly this, to coordinate scanning for multiple IP addresses. This obviously isn't really practical if you're just a small-time shop or an individual. You probably only have your one address. You can always buy VPN access or something, but a lot of services will block the common VPNs. They know, like for example, all the largest VPN companies, they know their IP ranges roughly, and they can block traffic that comes from them. Another thing that you can do if you're trying to avoid being detected is to throttle your scan traffic. So if you know that they only send ICMP unreachable messages once a second, then you don't send any faster than once a second. Of course, that can make scanning take a very long time, but NMAP has a bunch of different features for scanning at different rates. So you can tell it to scan very aggressively or very slowly. You can specify how long you want it to wait between different transmissions. And you can also try to scan out of order. That's a pretty obvious advantage here, is that when you're not scanning sequentially, it looks a lot less suspicious. So you scan port 3, and then port 537, and then 8, and then 432, and then eventually you get the whole range, but a lot less suspicious this way. And NMAP in particular has features to just scan the high value ports first, so the ones where applications are most likely to be. So you're looking for SSH and FTP and HTTP, all of these different applications that are most likely to be running and most likely to have an exploit available to them. You really don't care if color grid is running, right? Because nobody knows what that is. So you see port 6112 open with some random application that's a complete mystery. That's probably not super valuable to you unless you're a real professional and you're really crafting something complicated. So red's advantage in this scenario, basically, the party that's scanning is red in this case. Their advantage is that if blue is too aggressive in blocking traffic that looks scan-like, then they might end up blocking real users. And if blue can respond to legitimate requests from strangers, so if blue's able to get requests from the internet in general, well then eventually they're going to serve red's requests too, because red is very hard to distinguish from any other random stranger on the internet. That means for blue, there's really no perfect defense except just blocking all strangers from making connections or not sending those ICMP unreachable messages or everything in any case. And neither of those are really good solutions. So there really is no perfect defense against scanning. Even though we have tools that make it more likely that we're going to at least frustrate red a little bit, ultimately red will be able to scan the network. Blue's advantage is basically installing red, making it take longer to scan those ports. The longer you make it take for them, the more often you can just switch the ports up on them. A very common way to protect your network, if you have a machine that you connect to by SSH, right, and that you do stuff on remotely, so you administer it remotely, right? If you ever look at the logs, if you have a machine like that and it's exposed to the public internet, you'll see that there are constantly scans on it. And there are probably even constantly automated attempts to exploit low-hanging fruit in case you didn't update your SSH protocol. You just get those automatically. It's just the price of doing business if you run a server that has SSH enabled. But if you merely move the port that it uses, all right, so just don't use the default and move it to like 5,000, it's shocking how many fewer attempts you will get to crack your SSH. You can cut it by like 90% and up just by moving the port. And that's such a stupid and simple trick, and it fools nobody who's really trying, right? I mean, obviously, if they really want to break into your network, they're going to see that you just moved your SSH to another port and it's still SSH and all that. But just the act of moving it there gets rid of so many of those automated scanners and things. So my recommendation is, if you have a public port like that, if you have an SSH administered machine or something, just move it. It's so simple to do, and it really does save you a lot of potentially automated attacks. You never know when you're going to forget to update and there's going to be something out there that's able to compromise your service. So just move the port, and it's really helpful. And obviously you can't move your port if you're doing something like hosting a web server, because people, in order to connect to you, need to be able to connect on the port that they know, which is typically 80. But you can do it for other services easily. It's not typically done because of the headache involved. Just like if you have a bunch of different machines that you SSH into on a regular basis, but this one uses port 5000, that's kind of irritating, right? But if you kind of do it as a standard practice, it's not as much headache, and it can definitely, again, help to avoid the low-hanging fruit attacks. This kind of obfuscation is pretty hard to detect from Red's perspective. I mean, it's not impossible. There's still the whole service fingerprinting and everything, but one of the biggest aspects of fingerprinting is which port is it on. That's the most obvious hint. And now, of course, if you don't care about strangers, which is true of any domestic internet connection, you don't want anybody connecting to your household residential internet connection, then just block everything, right? And that's fine. Block basically all incoming traffic that you didn't explicitly solicit. That's the general approach that ISPs take to their residential customers. They don't respond to ICMP messages. They don't respond to, pings or ICMP unreachable or anything like that. They don't send resets when they're sent TCP. They just don't send anything. And then it's very hard to scan a network like that, a residential one. Alright, so let's get into how to use Nmap. Alright, so ports are either going to be marked as open, closed, or filtered. If they are open, they're accepting traffic. You don't know what kind, and you don't know what it's for, but you know it's open. If they're closed, then they reject all traffic, and if they're filtered, then they might accept traffic, but it is subject to the rules of a firewall. So generally closed, filtered, pretty much the same thing from your point of view. Closed ports will typically respond in a predictable way. You'll either get a reset if you're trying to send a TCP message, or an ICMP unreachable if you're trying to send a UDP message. Open ports will often give no response, especially like we talked about in the case of UDP. So it's very difficult to tell the difference between an open port and you accidentally lost a packet. So if you get no response, sometimes what you'll see in applications like Nmap is they'll try again a couple times just to make sure. And filtered ports, for this reason, are often very hard to differentiate from open ports too, because you'll get no response, and it's the same thing as an open port, depending on how their machine is configured. So here are some common ports that Nmap likes to scan. If you do the sort of the common scan, you'll get these and several others. These are all in that reserved range, that's 0 through 1024, that are reserved for applications. You've got your FTP, your file transfer protocol. Not used too often anymore, but still pretty popular for transferring things between machines. That runs on 20 and 21, generally on TCP. I think there's an option to change it for UDP, but it's almost always on TCP. You've got your SSH, which I just talked about. That's for basically controlling machines remotely, so that's very common as well. It's how most Linux machines in the world are administered and maintained. Nobody walks up to them and plugs a keyboard in and does stuff. No, they SSH into them, do what they need to do, and then SSH out. So this is probably the way that most computers in the world are actually administered, or at least most of the ones that aren't for personal use are administered over SSH in some way or another. You've got your HTTP, your general web traffic, that runs on 80 again. Again, some of these have UDP options, but they default to TCP. So a couple ones that are UDP, let's say there's DNS, which we haven't looked at yet, that runs on 53, and then DHCP, which we did look at already, which runs on 67 and 68. So remember, you have to have a DHCP server on your network somewhere to handle the distribution of IP addresses. That server listens on 67 and 68. So how might we do a simple scan if we were to write our own in Java? Well, we could just do a socket attempt to connect type thing. So this would be a TCP scan here. We would just build a new socket, try to connect to the destination address and the port that we're interested in. And if we get a connection, if the socket is successfully built, then we know the port is open. And if it fails, then we know it's filtered or closed. So this would be a simple scanner, but Java is a poor language for scanning because this is basically the best we can do. We don't really have access to low-level functionality like the SYN handshake. We're not able to send a SYN packet, for example, in Java with the standard library. We can't send just a packet with the SYN and see what we get back. That's not part of what we're able to do. We're basically in Java only able to push bytes into a socket and extract them. We have very little access over the packet and the features of the packet itself. So most of these scanning softwares are going to be written in languages like C, where you have a lot more access to changing different packet settings. Let's look at the first and probably most popular of Nmap scans. This one is for TCP. It's called the SYN scans. I think sometimes they'll call it the stealth SYN scan. When a SYN packet arrives and it is unsolicited, so there's no session available, the server's not listening, it should send a reset like we discussed earlier. If there is a server listening on that port, then it will try to create a session. But remember that if you try to create a bunch of sessions without closing them, so without acknowledging them, you leave the server hanging. That's an attack, actually. It's called the SYN flood. And if you do that to a bunch of different ports, you look very suspicious. You look an awful lot like you're trying to perform a SYN flood. So in addition to sending that initial SYN packet, Nmap will attempt to be nice, and it will actually also send the acknowledgement. It follows the SYNAC in order to establish that connection and demonstrate that it is not malicious. So it'll complete the session and then also close it so it doesn't look like it's trying to perform a SYN flood. This is to avoid detection, not just to be nice, so we're trying not to get flagged as a DDoS and trying not to get flagged as a scanner. Now obviously some servers don't send a reset message on closed ports, they just send nothing. In that case, this scan is likely to fail or not return any useful results anyway. So, do I have a volunteer to run those two services, a UDP and a TCP service, on ports 6 to 7000? I'm going to try all the different scans on the volunteer. If I do have a volunteer, can I get your IP address in either chat? Alright, give me your IP address or DM it to me, and I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to use the graphical interface version of NMAP, the one that comes for us Windows peasants, and I'm also going to open up Wireshark so that we can see what NMAP is actually doing. Okay. So first I want to do that SS scan. There are a few options here in the drop-down. I generally don't use any of these because they're not exactly what I want. But I'm going to pick a regular scan. Let's see, what's a quick scan? Which one has -SS in it? You've got intense. Let's see, intense scan all ports. Let's just go with a regular scan, which is just NMAP with nothing fancy. I'm going to put in our victim's IP address here. And again, if you want to follow along as a stress test, you can, but I think it's likely that if we all do this, we're going to crash the network. So we've got the IP address in there. You'll see it just adds it to the command. So this line here, this command area, is just what you would have written in console if you were running this in console. This is really kind of a useless graphical user interface. It doesn't really do much. And I'm going to add that -SS flag to it. So you'll see profile went blank. This is now a custom profile. Now you can add your own profile. So if you want to add this -SS profile, maybe it'll come in handy for the exam. You could do that here. And I'm going to add this option, which is very important, the -P option. This allows me to specify a specific range of ports that I want to scan. So I'm going to scan just between 6 and 7000, which is where I asked our volunteer to put their service that they're running, their TCP service that they're running. I'm going to paste that in there and show you, actually, if you look at the all ports one. So if you look at the all TCP ports one, it uses the same -P argument, and it puts 1 to 65,000 whatever there. Okay, that's actually not the default, so you actually need to put that if you want to get all the ports. I think the default scans between 1 and like 40,000 something. We might look at this later. And let's see, I think there's at least one other built-in one that scans just a particular range of ports. Quick scan plus, trace route, regular. Nope. No, there aren't. Okay. So we're going to go back to my custom one here. I don't know if Control V works, and I don't want to find out. Okay, so I'm going to hit scan to run this, and we'll see what happens in my Wireshark here. So I'm going to sort by, let's say, TCP, and let's just sort by TCP first and see what I can see. There's a lot of other traffic going here, so maybe I can try to apply the destination too. IP.destination is 143.105.164.90. Okay, so look at all of these different SYNs I sent. Woo, look at them all go. And you see that they didn't happen quite sequentially. It's a little bit out of order, so it's trying not to get caught, as it's very obvious if I just sent 6 to 7,000 sequentially. It just jumps all over the range. I got 6,000 8 here, then 556, then 416, so I got them all over the place, and I found one port that was open, 6821. Let's see if I can find what that open port looked like in Wireshark. There we go, we got a 6821. It's the only one that sent me a reset message, right? All of the others sent me nothing back. That one sent me a reset message. Okay, but let me see what else they sent me, because I also want to see if the IP's source is that address. Alright, I'll be bold, I'll use Control-C. It does work, lovely. Oops, I want that to be an OR, so I want the messages going to or from my target here. So I've got TCP and the IP.destination is my target, or the source is my target, because I want to see what happens on some of those other ones. Okay, so you see I've got a couple other resets in there, actually quite a few. In fact, I have a reset for, if it's correct, every single one that I send, I should get a reset. Anytime I get a reset, that's when I know that I have a closed port. So all of these different resets that I'm seeing, those are for all the closed ports. So that reset that I saw earlier, the one that I saw for the port that was open, that's a reset that my machine sent in response to getting the reset or a particular piece of traffic from their machine, which we'll see in a bit here once I find the one that was open, because I'm too lazy to just type in the port. Can't find it. I know it was somewhere in the middle here. Okay, I'm just going to go with the port here. TCP port is, and I found it was 6821. There we go. So I sent the SYN to them, and on this one, I actually got the SYN ACK in response. Okay, so that's what I was looking for. That's how I know that it's open and it's able to accept TCP communications. I've got a SYN that I sent to it, and I got a SYN ACK back, indicating that I am getting the handshake. You'll notice that this version did not send the polite acknowledgement back. This version of Nmap here just ghosted the other connection. Didn't send them anything after that. And after they sent me the SYN ACK, because it was unsolicited as far as my computer is concerned, there is no TCP session at that port, because Nmap basically just sends a raw TCP packet without establishing a socket. So it's not actually building a socket. C allows you to do that. Java does not. Java needs us to build a socket to send anything. So because it just sends that raw TCP packet, there's no socket for the SYN ACK response to go to, and my machine sends out a reset in response, which is itself pretty suspicious. Again, another easy way to detect that kind of scanning. Okay, so any questions on what we've seen here so far? How the SS scan worked, that we just sent a bunch of SYNs, and we looked to see if we got a SYN ACK back, and if we did not, if we got a reset instead, then we know that it's closed. If we did, if we got a SYN ACK back, then we know that it's open. So this was a pretty straightforward one. And that this piece of information here was wrong in this case. It doesn't send the friendly ACK, so it does look like a SYN flood. Alright, TCP scans based on malformed packets. There are a few different options like this. Now these, we call them malformed. Let's see, I got a cool message in chat here. I believe you put your flags out of order, whoever it is that put that in chat. I think the IP address has to be the last thing in your commands. So for the scan that we just did, it would be nmap-ss-p 6000 to 7000, and then the IP address that you're targeting. So I think the IP address has to be last. Let's see if I can just copy and paste this command in. I'll just retype it. Too hard to copy from the VM. You can see if you get the same results as me. You might not. Again, we might get flagged as a DDoS by the network, and it might start blocking traffic here or there. I am going to stop my Wireshark as well and resume it on the next one here, so I don't have a Wireshark full of packets. Alright, so the scan's based on malformed packets. We know that there are these flags in TCP, the SYN, the reset, the ACK, all these different flags you can set. So we can make packets that don't make sense using the normal TCP configuration, and then different systems will respond to these in different ways when they get a packet that doesn't make sense. So the -sn command sets all of these flags to 0. There are no normal TCP packets that have all of the flags set to 0. Remember, the first packet in the handshake has SYN set, but nothing else, and then every packet after that usually has ACK set at least, so you generally don't see something with all the flags on 0, and it's up to the machine how they're going to respond. Let's see how the VMs respond to having all the flags set to 0, so I'm going to change this to -sn, and then scan again, and we'll see what we get. Now I'm not going to, well, alright, I'll put this one up in Wireshark too, see what it looks like. We got nothing. All the ports were closed. Let me try another then. Let me try, among the fancy scans, there is the -sf, which sets just the fin flag. So it tries to set it tries to send a fin without actually having an established session. That doesn't make any sense. So let's see how this machine responds to that. So notice we have a bunch of TCP segments coming out in Wireshark with just the fin flag set. And again, we've got no response in this case. Alright. Let's try. Well, there are others, but we're not going to waste our time looking at all of these. And you can always set your own with the --scan flags command. So these typically don't work anymore. There was a time when different operating systems, different applications would respond to these in strange ways, and you could identify what they were based on that. But generally speaking, today you're going to get no response on these because that's just the way that modern operating systems are configured, just not to respond to malformed packets. The one that has a funny name, when we call it a Christmas tree scan, is because all the flags are set to 1. So everything is lit up like a Christmas tree. Haha. Alright, so then you've got your UDP scan. Well, that's TCP, those different approaches there. Let's try the UDP scan here. Now remember, UDP has no sessions and doesn't send an acknowledgement, so let's see what we get for open and closed ports. Let's try that out. Assuming we haven't been blocked yet, so I'm going to change it to -SU for UDP, and I'm scanning again in that 6,000 to 7,000 range. And I'm going to change my Wireshark to look at UDP instead. So you'll notice this one's taking a little bit longer. I still haven't gotten my results. And you actually see the packets coming up in a Wireshark kind of one at a time. And it's taken quite a bit though. Like you can actually see them scroll by 1 per second or so. It's a pretty slow process. And what am I getting most of the time? I'm getting one of these ICMP destination unreachable messages. Let's see if I can try to snag one here. ICMP destination unreachable, code 3, port unreachable. That tells me that the port is not open. So very nice of the receiving end, the victim computer in this case, to send me that. Now, because we are inside the JCU network and there's probably a degree of trust for machines within the network, I'm getting one of these, but I'll bet that if I tried to send traffic from outside the network, if I tried to do the same scan from my home computer, for example, I would just get nothing, because that's a common way that IT would configure it. Oh, looks like I might have found one, because this port, this 6821, what happened here? I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 packets sent to it. Why would it send 8 packets to it? It's probably making sure that it's not getting an ICMP unreachable message. So, if it was unreachable, but perhaps the unreachable message got lost, we wouldn't want to accidentally flag it as open. So again, what NMAP will do, what scanning applications will do, is once they see one that got no response, well, no response is not a very a definitive thing on its own. So once we see no response, we try to send a bunch more, and we make sure we're still getting no response. So this is probably the one that's actually open. We'll see at the end. But again, this scan's going to take a while to finish, so I'm going to go talk about it while we wait for it to wrap up, assuming it even does. Okay, so we saw right there that open ports generally reply with nothing, and closed ports reply with an ICMP unreachable. And again, domestic internet connections or properly configured ones from IT departments that know what they're doing are probably going to send nothing back. So why does anyone respond at all? Why ever respond to ICMP messages? Why not just always not respond? If that makes you immune to scanning, aren't the benefits obvious there? Well, yes, there are obviously many benefits to being immune to scanning. But if everybody on the internet did that, then the internet wouldn't work at all. So there are different protocols we've looked at so far that rely on ICMP, right? Like traceroute, for example, relies on ICMP, and ping obviously relies on ICMP. So if those didn't work, a lot of the internet wouldn't work. So somebody has to bite the bullet. In fact, most people have to bite the bullet and allow these types of messages. And likewise for those reset segments that get sent out when a TCP port is unreachable. If someone is trying to access your server and you run a service and they pay you for that service and they attempt to connect on the wrong port and you send them nothing, that is not helping their diagnostics and figuring out why they can't connect. To them, it just looks like your server is down in that case, which can be frustrating. And there are many other reasons why you basically need to configure your publicly accessible servers that people are paying for to respond to traffic in a predictable way. Alright, we've also got, we probably should have covered this first, but we've got the ping scan. This is used to just see if a machine is online or not. So this just sends a simple ping. Remember, a ping is also called a ICMP echo request. I made a little typo there, whoops. An ICMP echo request. So that's exactly the same kind of echo request that you'll see when you send a ping or a trace route. Another thing that Nmap will do to catch some kind of low-hanging fruit is try to send a TCP ACK to port 80. This tests for web servers, which are probably the most common kind of server that we want to look for. It's also true that most web servers, so most servers that are running a website actively, don't respond to pings. It's kind of a conservation of resources thing. And of course, you'd still want to see them online, and they're also high-value targets. So in this way, Nmap can cover both regular things that respond to ping and also web servers. And again, most domestic connections simply refuse to respond to ICMP ping requests. Now, what actually happens when you run Nmap like a UDP scan or a TCP scan, it will attempt to do a ping scan on the target first. So we'll always try to see if the machine is online first, unless you specify another flag, which we'll look at on the next slide. And then there's the connect scan, -st. This is very much like the crappy Java example that we wrote, where it actually tries to establish the whole socket. Usually this gives you worse results than SS, but it sometimes finds ports that SS thinks are merely filtered. By establishing that whole socket, sometimes it finds extras that SS does not. Historically, this was included for users that didn't have root access. It was considered basically inferior in every way, but it's something that you could do if you didn't have root, because in order to send those raw random SYN packets without a socket, that required you to have administrator permissions on your computer. I'm not actually sure if that's still the case, but it definitely was at some point. Oof, 1,000 ports might have been too much. This is taking a good long time. Now, what do you think would happen if I stopped this partway through? Do you still think I would get the result for the one port I was looking at? We'll find out if we run out of time. And as a reminder, you will probably have to use Nmap on the exam, so make sure that you're familiar with how to do these commands that I ran today. Alright, some other things that you can do. So -p, obviously to limit the range of ports that you scan. Whenever we do stuff for the exam or whatever, I'm going to ask you to use this. So for number one, it doesn't take forever. Number two, we don't fill the network with traffic. Remember 1 through 1024, the reserve ports where lots of important things run. And then up to 49,000, you've got the ports used by most other applications. And then from 49,151 to the last port available, those are the dynamic ports. Those are typically used as one-offs or for brief use when our applications choose a random port to use for the sending end. They'll usually pick a port in that range. So you'll see that I've chosen 54750. That's within that range of 49,151 and up. And so anytime you're running your different applications that you've written and you see the client's choice of random port, it'll almost always be in that ephemeral port range. So you can actually still hard code your applications to use ports in that range. It's just a suggestion. It's not required that those all be these kind of ephemeral ports, but this is typically how they're used. All right, we've covered everything we need to cover, and that's going to be probably it for today. Next time we'll look at some of the other options. We've got our P0 to use an IP datagram instead of a ping to see if a server's online. Our PN skips ping and goes straight to the scan, so it scans regardless of whether the server responds to ping or not. You're probably not going to have to use these on the exam, so just be familiar with the basic scans for TCP and UDP. I'm going to give you probably a range or something, and you're going to have to find the server. And since we're out of time and this scan hasn't finished, I'm going to go ahead and stop it, and we'll see what we get. No results. What a shame, right? And what was that one that I found that was actually reachable? Let's see if I could still find it in the list. This is tough. Here it was, 6821. Let's see if I can just scan that one exactly. 6821. Let's see if that's the one I'm thinking of. We have it either open or filtered. Okay, so that's something. And let's try scanning a small range there to see if there are some others that aren't. So I just put a range of 3 ports. So I've got 6821 is the open one, and the other 2 are closed. And my volunteer can tell me if I got those 2 right, the TCP and the UDP port. Okay, yeah, we're over time for today, so I will see you guys on Friday for the exam.